Good morning and welcome to the National Newspaper Publishers Association's Let It Be Known. It is Monday, November 7th, 2022, just 24 hours before Election Day. Election officials say voter intimidation efforts are worsening. And Michigan, Nevada, and Pennsylvania, three consequential states in this midterms, are no different. Each state has witnessed recent threats to the safety and security of their elections. And it's no secret that voter suppression efforts, especially in the form of voter intimidation, specifically targeting and hurting voters of color the most. One organization is working to protect voters of color in Michigan, Nevada, and Pennsylvania in the face of election threats. That is State Voices. What a network they've put together. And here to talk about it is Brandon Jessup, the Deputy Director of Data Analytics and Movement Technology. Good morning, Brandon.
Hey, good morning, Stacey. How you doing?
Doing great. Great to have you. Thanks for taking the time out, joining the Black Press this morning. Look, tell us about State Voices. When did the organization begin and what's been the primary focus?
Well, State Voices has been a network since early 2006, starting in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Florida, and a few other states. And it's really been not about like being a very upfront organization. We are the network of 1,200 organizations of partners across the country, focused on year-round civic engagement, right? So when you think about like the successes that you've seen in Georgia over the last few years, when you hear about Michigan and the ballot initiatives that they passed that are pro-democracy, expanding voting rights for Black folks, it's centered around Black, Indigenous, and people of color. It's those types of initiatives that we're proud to say come from our network. And so as State Voices, we make sure that all the framework, all the technology that's necessary to power movements is available to folks like the NAACP, the ACLU, Common Cause, Black Lives Matter, a lot of folks.
Yeah, and we see again the attacks, not just the suppression efforts, but there's violence. Political violence. There's this effort to by all means stop voters of color, and you guys truly are. Have been answering the call. I know that I read somewhere in 2020 you helped lead an election protection hotline, which answered 228,000 calls. Are you anticipating the same thing this year?
Well, absolutely, and State Voices is a partner with the Election Protection Hotline, with the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights, the NAACP, right? So many groups power that hotline across the country to make sure we have right now real-time support for folks who have issues when voting. Now, I will say that we've seen across the country not a lot of challenges up front, but you've seen like in Wayne County here in Michigan that a candidate for office has challenged over 30,000 voters in Wayne County, specifically targeting Black people. In Arizona, similar actions in Maricopa County targeting Latinx and people of colors in their ballots. In Georgia, in Gwinnett County, just this past October, 22,000 voters were challenged on the voter rolls before they even cast their ballot, right? So these are the activities that are happening, and you don't know about it until after you cast your ballot. Okay, right. So this is that shadow operation that came post-insurrection, that came with all these weird right-wing candidates running for public offices like your county clerks, your county election boards, your school districts, and now they're in position in some states to count the vote. And so when we talk about election protection, right now it's not just about answering the calls when you have a problem at the polls. It's pre and post election as well.
And so State Voices, the network is obviously you guys have had to at least double down on your efforts. What are you hearing most, and where is the problems? We mentioned some states, but where are you finding the problems to be worse?
I will say that right now there's not a lot of big states with problems right now. You do have like Louisiana, states that have gone through some serious redistricting efforts. Alabama, Pennsylvania, as always. Right now you got a really hotly contested race. But what people are calling the hotline for right now is like, hey, I'm at the right polling location. It's just simple like navigational kind of stuff, and that's great, right? Because now we can see the trend when people talk about voter participation going up. the fact is that, like, yes, more ballots have been cast this year than were cast all of 2018 early votes and absentee ballots. Okay. So, yes, we know that voter participation is up. We know that people of color are voting more in states like Georgia. And we're looking at higher trends in Michigan and Pennsylvania. But tomorrow is going to be key, right? You're going to have a lot of people walking up to the polls. A lot of people are motivated to vote this year. We see in states like Nevada and in North Carolina and Michigan that voters are motivated more than they were in the past to get out and cast their ballot. So you're going to see a higher Black participation in the polls, but the real challenges are going to be tomorrow, the day of, where you see a lot of changes in the law, and the day after, provisional ballots being cast. That's when really that happens on Tuesday, not really the time before. So we encourage as many folks who are in states where you can vote early to do so. It gives you time to fix problems if you have any.
Yeah, and you mentioned about going up to the polls. What about fear? Some people are some people in Florida getting arrested for even trying to vote.
Oh,
Uh,
that's one of the most egregious actions I've ever seen. In Arizona as well, right? You saw just this weekend, a judge allowing what they call them those freedom folks, whatever they want to call themselves as. But they used to be called citizen councils, right, in the early 20th century, that they could be 200 feet from a drop box location with loaded rifles, with AR-15s.
right.
And so this isn't about gun rights. This is about pure intimidation. All right, that's all that is. So, and remember, so they're not only in view of the folks at the drop box, but like in Michigan, electioneers and pollsters and things like that, they're within 100 feet of the doorway to an entrance. So in Michigan, we have similar gun laws as you talked about in Arizona. North Carolina has similar gun laws as you see in Arizona as well. You have a lot of these open carry states. So believe me, like that whole operation that comes from the right, that comes from that ultra radical attitude in this country that's been alive for not just 6 years. It's been alive way probably most of the last decade. And we could both agree to that. Is very active, and they take the action on election day. So we got to gear up. Once again, if anyone has any issues at the polls, they can call 1-866 our vote, or they can text 1-866 our vote and have a live conversation with an attorney.
Yes, there are some people on one side saying that increased law enforcement presence at the polls should help, but I'm guessing many others, including your organization, doesn't necessarily agree with that, particularly when it comes to protecting voters of color.
Absolutely not. As that's not the case. I don't want to see no law enforcement anywhere near the ballot or the ballot box, right? We often, as a nonpartisan organization, as a network, we pride ourselves in building coalitions of activists and community members that can get directly engaged and build relationships with election administrators, right? And the folks who are actually working to polling locations in their neighborhoods. Let's be honest, Stacey, you and I both know. It's our aunts, it's our uncles, right? It's our grandparents that work those polling locations, okay? Often those polling locations in our community are our churches. There are schools, right? There are pieces of our community. So it makes sense for us to organize with the same people who maintain that space, and that builds power for them, so we can have those deeper conversations about representation. So we're proud to be able to do that.
Yeah.
And that's what we encourage.
And Brandon, obviously, money and power, some of the most valuable resources in the fight for a healthy democracy. But what kind of relationship building do you believe is needed, and what kind of investments are needed in communities of color?
Well, I will always say that the State Voices Network encourages year-round civic engagement. All right. Regardless of what happens partisan-wise tomorrow, that the need for student loan debt relief is still going to be high on the consciousness of many people across this country. Many Black folks like myself are concerned about whether or not that's going to be a real thing post this election. And so investing in the technologies, right, the tools that we use to move for the movement. And so part of our work as a network is driven in the spirit of people of color leading the data collection behind the civil rights movement in the United States, right? So remember, it was Ida B. Wells that was initially recording how many men were being lynched before the NAACP started to actually hang that flag because they weren't keeping record, right? It's Raynard Ruskin that was organizing in the background, right, with figuring out like the navigational points and how to connect people logistically to get them to Washington D.C. to align the message. So we've been really in that space. And that means that we heavily invest in people who can analyze data, who can collect data, who can understand how we advocate like 21st century policies, right? That connect voter rights, right? And how we connect like a next level of democracy in this country. One of our newest partners in Alabama, Alabama Ford, it led to fight earlier this last month to the Supreme Court regarding redistricting, right? So that's young Black people in the movement, not just being in front of the camera, but pushing for legislative change as well.
Yeah, we're talking with Brandon Jessup, the Deputy Director of Data Analytics and Movement Technology for State Voices, the network that's protecting Black voters. And there's a lot of protections to be done. And it's gotten worse. You know, Brandon, obviously you certainly sound like a student of the political game, if you will.
A little bit.
But obviously the task has increased. The task has gotten probably tougher, more complex. Where do we go from here? Because what's next if this is allowed to continue? All of the suppression efforts, the scare tactics that we've already talked about, if that's allowed to continue even through tomorrow, because tomorrow most people say it's the most consequential election that we've seen. I mean, we heard that in 2020, which, you know, I guess you can't really argue with that. What's next? What are people facing if these tactics are allowed to exist through tomorrow and on to the next election?
I wanna take a step back. Like, so when you're kind of close to the ground, and I'm not the person on the ground every day, right? But when I look at the returns across the country, and I'm not polling the same group, white conservative males who have landline phones every day, who already know how to tip the scales of these elections to make them, of these polls, to make them sound closer than what they are. Okay. So when we take our pulses, we're not measuring for the pulse of like, okay, after Tuesday, what happens? It's okay, so what can we do to continue to advance your agency as a community, right? What are your issues, right? And so over this time frame, we heard that jobs in the economy are the main conversation, right? So yes, while unemployment is at 3.5%, and a lot of politicians say things are great, Black people still earn less than the white average male in the United States. Unemployment amongst African American males still remains to be twice as high as their white counterparts. For the Latinx and other people of color and the migrant community, they have a harder travel to gaining citizenship than any other community in the United States. And so and that means that they often work for lower wages and poor working conditions than anyone else in this country. I'm in Detroit. I'm from the labor community, right? My daddy is UAW. My daddy is a sharecropper as well. He came up from the South from sharecropping. So when we talk about like understanding the lineage of labor and respecting people's work and their human value, that's what, you know, you come to this country for. It's like, how can I really maximize what I can do? You come to America to do that. So we got to continue to fight that way. So it's these municipal races, right? You got mayor's elections in Philadelphia, I believe, coming up in next year. So let's not take next year as an off season. We got new state legislatures, which will be a lot more conservative than what the national media is projecting. That's where the fight is. It's these state legislatures, because regardless of what happens nationally, right? If it's still that gridlock that we know, that we've come to know over the last 20 years, the most significant change that's been impacting people of color has happened at the state level, right? You look at the challenges to women's reproductive rights. It started in Mississippi, and then you saw a total ban in Texas, right?
Yeah.
So that's where the change is happening. That's where the fight is Wednesday.
Yeah, and you mentioned these so-called down ballots, but how important Secretary of State, right?
That's right.
There's a few races there. I know in Massachusetts, a woman of color is trying to become the Secretary of State there. Um, Elections officials, these are all little. I guess people don't think much about these positions until it
Mm-hmm.
actually a 2020 happens, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Mm-hmm.
Brad Rasberg, that situation down in
When
Georgia,
something breaks, now you want to know who broke it, right? Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so education obviously is a continual process, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely. It's a continual process, and it's not like the classroom process of here's the map and
Hmm.
this person reports it. Here's the grid and the chart. We got to show people how to navigate, civically, right? That's really what it is, and that's when we start to see the points in like local government that are broken, right? And you talk about how cities like Detroit can go through a whole entire bankruptcy and their seniors lose pensions. You talk about losing 80% of some of their pensions, right? And so those grievances that we hear every day from when we're door knocking, right? Or from folks in Philadelphia who's going through the same thing, or when we're door knocking in California, folks who are in South Central and Watts whose grandparents going through the same thing, right? And you're watching all these communities go bankrupt, and then but you hear the issues about, well, hey, I've been trying to get my park to get the grass cut for the last 6 months, right? It's those basic things. So we're helping folks to make those connections, and so now getting that feedback that like, yes, we do need better folks to run for office when it comes down to city council. And that's where the issue comes to lie. And I've got to be very honest. We mentioned it earlier, talking about money in elections. That's where the hurdle lies for our community,
Hmm.
right? It's elections are becoming more and more costly, even though the barriers to entry are low, right? And so it's not about the television ad, because you will never see a lot of our network partners on television doing ads.
Right.
You won't. It's the direct connections and relationships. Because I know the pastor at the church, because we've been having breakfast for the last 10 years, because we stay around the corner from each other.
So to your point too, you're right. These TV ads and things of that nature, there is a large constituency that does not pay much attention to television in itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so we need when you get when you're getting the word out, where do you go? Let me ask it that way. Where do you go, especially for our community?
Um, we found that honestly, folks' most trusted messengers are the people who they touch every day. So how do we identify those people and make sure that they're empowered? So what we've
Right.
seen over the last 2 years is that social media has really created a lot of rabbit holes for people to be bad actors in our community. And so some people, you may see them in their celebrity even act as a bad actor against our community. We've seen at least one example of that recently in the last couple of weeks.
I don't know who that
So,
was, but
hey, so when you think about, right, like how can I better inform like my nephews and my uncles and whomever else, it is through text messages, right? But it's not like just the bland text message, are you ready to vote? It's, hey, it's next March, and this legislation is coming up about job creation in the community. You told us about this 2 months ago. I'm following back up.
Mhm.
That's what makes a difference, because our communities and America period recognizes brands,
Right,
right?
right.
So all of that rush around this time and the urgency around elections is great, but it's a lot of noise. What do you do when things quiet down and then you can really build? So our network, we have a host of technology right now, right? And you'll probably see our partners are probably sending text messages this evening, right? Encouraging folks to either, if we're states where they could vote early, they are. In states where they're we have a part of our election protection program allows us to identify folks whose ballots have been flagged for potential rejection. So
Mhm.
we have like the ability to reach out to some of those voters in a third party way and say, hey, we just want to let you know this happened. You want to contact your county clerk or whomever the appropriate agency is to go handle that in advance, right? Because those are the things that make a difference tomorrow. It's those 100 votes here, those 20 votes there, right, that make a big difference. And making sure like the people are speaking in their voice, our partners are speaking in their voice,
Yeah.
right? So it's like it's watching a message come from one big national group spread out thousands of ways, and you just watch it return with 36 million folks voting early.
Brandon, when you look at history and you look at the civil rights movement and SNCC and SCLC and all the work that they did to ensure voting rights, people of color, um, we look in, more than a half century later, we're talking about protecting voters of color. Does it make sense that we have to talk about that now?
No,
That has
it
to be
doesn't
talked
feel
about now.
good. It doesn't feel good. You don't want to. We would want to think that we all um to can kind of touch and agree about it, but something worth having is going to have opposition, right?
Mhm.
Voting is powerful. Voting is powerful, and you hear it so many times in dog whistle speeches from folks when they talk about the change and people of color taking over and all those types of things. Like, so you hear about in the dog whistles, but the fact is, like, yes, as more people of color engage in democracy, um, we can definitely sway and lead this country, right? It's lead this country. I think that's what people need to really grasp. You saw it in Georgia. Regardless of what happens, I think that you will see that people of color right now are 35% of the early vote. Black folks specifically are 35% of the early vote. So if they only 13%, right, of the state's population, but if they 35% of turnout right now, like, that's power,
Mhm.
right? You know what I'm saying? You double your representation.
Yeah.
So let's, when we start to talk about stuff like that, like, yeah, let's look at it that way.
And speaking of power and black voters, are they recognized? Do you find black voters recognize the power that they have?
Um, I think we need to do a better job talking about that. I really do. I think we start talking about it in partisan ways and how it translates into parties and stuff. But you and I both know, I think, like, being in this space about civil rights, being advocates for the community, and like, yeah, like, when do you go back and assess what you really did? A lot of folks are announcing agendas, but we never talk about the review of what's happened because they look at it from a spirit of, did this meet my agenda? That's not what it is. The work has been continuous, like we said earlier. This is a continuum of work. So as we advance voting rights, as we codify, right, voting rights and as constitutional rights in states like Michigan, right, we know we got a long way to go when you think about it. You really do. We shouldn't have to have a Voting Rights Act of 1964 be the last piece of substantial legislation that looks at our voting rights as a community, right? And you've seen it just be picked apart in the
Mhm.
Supreme Court. So, and I think right now with them talking about affirmative action, they're going to probably pick at some of the last strings of what race matters in this country, right? Does race matters in this country anymore? That's a question that we're looking at.
Mhm. And you're right. The Supreme Court is currently weighing that affirmative action, um, ostensibly due to Harvard and UNC and their admission policies, but that is not just restricted to that, right? I mean, that's far reaching right there, isn't it?
That's right. That's right. And I was 20 years ago now, I was organizing here in Michigan regarding Bollinger versus Gratz, the initial affirmative action case in Berkeley versus California, Bakke versus California, University of California, Berkeley. And so, like, those cases when we're dealing with like college admissions and those initial score systems, they what we're challenging now are those adjustments. Okay, so 20 years ago, UNC and Harvard made adjustments based off of what was ruled regarding the University of Michigan. And so now, and the sun's coming up, so over here in Michigan. So now, you see a new challenge to it. So where are our renewed challenges to advance rights and agency in the United States for Black, Indigenous, and people of color?
Mm. It's interesting. It's all too interesting. So protecting voters of color, it's a huge thing. Has been, uh, Brandon. It seems, and I think we could take off the it seems part because it has gotten so much more worse than what we've seen in the past. I mean, we're looking at some Jim Crow type stuff when it comes to the election and elections. These different roadblocks that they're putting up for voters of color. Um, shouldn't that be that wake up call should have come already for voters of color?
Well, it has, and it's been answered by how when we call for poll workers and for election protection monitors, right? Like folks are answering the call right there, right? A lot of people are saying like, "Hey, no, I stand up and want to be trained," and you can also do the same thing in many states, especially like in Kentucky, Florida, Michigan, and Nevada, right? They always need poll workers and poll monitors to assist with just seeing what's going on, right? Because that's where we die first is the fact is that we may not have enough eyes on the ground to see what's going on and to be able to report back. So,
Yeah, Michelle Madison writes in that she'll be an election judge in Maryland tomorrow, and she said that in Maryland they had police presence in the morning. David Youngblood says that he remembers his parents dressed up to vote and volunteer on election day, but it sounds like we from everything we've discussed with you got armed folks going to the polls, and it sounds like we need more than just like you stated earlier, the aunts and the grandparents and who normally we see at the polls. Sounds like we need more than that.
uh, you know, it sometimes it make you feel that way, right? It does make you feel that way. I know that our communities, especially like communities of color, know who will come in those spaces to provide that community space and protection. Right, those spots of intimidation, like you heard about in Arizona, they
Hmm.
really are way one offs where it's safe enough to do that because the local community ain't gonna check you. You ain't gonna pull that off in a neighborhood full of folks who gonna come up and see you.
Hmm.
Right, right, right. I don't want to extend those stereotypes, but
Right.
it's just a fact. And so, and I've always seen this because yes, every election is busy and every election is monumental. But whenever I see people from my community, the folks who I thought would never turn out to vote, show up early, or they just hanging out and hanging around, they're not often always there just to be intimidated. They're probably there just to make sure nobody come to intimidate us.
Right.
You
Right.
know, so yeah, so I'm more concerned about the people who are dressed really nicely, who carry clipboards, who are looking for long lines
Hmm.
to exploit the fact that there are long lines,
Hmm.
right? Like one of the things I saw that worked really well in Georgia over the last couple of days, was that the election poll workers and all the administrators and the supporters around that space made sure the lines were short. If there's no wait time, there's no time for you to provide intimidation.
Mm. That's a great, great point. And so, again, before we let you go, Brandon, we really
Mm.
appreciate you taking out the time this morning. And as the sun comes up in Michigan, as you said, but
Uh-huh.
state voices. If anyone has any issues or questions, what's the hotline you have?
Yes, they can call the election protection hotline, which is 1-866 our vote. That is 1-866 OURVOTE. You can text or call the hotline and talk to somebody live if you have any issues or any questions regarding your vote.
Absolutely. Brandon Jessup, the Deputy Director of Data Analytics and Movement Technology for State Voices. We really appreciate you joining the Black Presses. Let it be known this morning. Thank you all for watching. Tomorrow, not only will we have our regularly scheduled Let It Be Known at 7:30 a.m., but we're going to have a special election night coverage beginning at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So join us not only tomorrow at 7:30 a.m., but 6:30 p.m. as we bring you a special election coverage that only the Black Press of America can. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you tomorrow.